Yo, friends, do you know what the largest organism in the world is? I'll give you a hint. It's not an elephant, it's not a blue whale. In fact, it actually puts those to shame. It is massive compared to those. If you don't know what it is, I'll tell you in 1 minute. I just kind of want to outline my video here for you today. We're going to talk about this amazing organism, this massive organism, and we're going to talk about another one very similar to it. And we're going to talk about how those organisms bring up some pretty deep, crazy, important questions about what it means to be alive and what it means to be a human. And then, because this is not a philosophy channel, it's a gardening and food forest channel, we will leave the philosophy alone and we will bring it all back around to how we can apply this to our backyard veggie garden. So, the largest organism on Earth is a mushroom. It's a honey fungus. It's out in Oregon, and this mushroom covers well over 2,000 acres. Now, when most of us hear mushroom, we immediately think of this, the above ground, easy to find, easy to spot piece of a fungus that is often edible or poisonous or psychedelic or some combination of the three. In reality, though, that above ground piece of a mushroom is more similar to an apple. An apple does not represent the whole apple tree, but is a small part. It's the fruiting body of the apple tree. So that fungus, that above ground piece, is actually part of a much bigger network of underground mycelium, we call it. If you've ever dug in your garden, or especially your wood chip pile, and see these white strands running through the soil, running through the wood chips, that's mycelium. That's the main body of a mushroom. And that is what periodically will send up the fruiting body of the mushroom, which will cast its spores out in the world. It's its way of propagating itself. So this 2,000 acre large honey fungus out west just spread its mycelium. It started as one minuscule microscopic spore that landed in the earth, and it started to spread its mycelium and spread its mycelium, and eventually that being grew so large that it covered multiple forests. Humans, for probably hundreds of years, walked this area and picked and ate those delicious mushrooms, not realizing that their friends on the other opposite side of the forest were eating really the same exact mushroom. Mushrooms are kind of hard for us to talk about in our society. They're not as well understood as plants. So let's talk about trees. This same thing exists in Utah. A single aspen seed was planted in the ground and grew into a tree. And that tree cloned itself and eventually created a literal forest of itself. 40,000 aspen trees, all with the same exact genetic makeup, all connected together. Aspen trees sucker really easily. That's when a tree or a bush or a shrub, as it sends out its roots, those roots then send out suckers or send out little shoots that eventually become another tree right next to the mother tree. The problem is that words kind of fail here because they're not another tree. It's the same tree. It just expresses itself as two different above ground parts. It's like if you buried your friend in sand at the beach and they poked up some fingers and they also poked up their toes. You kind of could say those are two separate things. There's a grouping of toes over there and a grouping of fingers over here, but in reality, it's one being that's expressing itself in two different above ground ways. So the philosophy, the spirituality here, this raises a really big question of what it means to be an individual. Because you would walk into this forest and say, wow, look at these 40,000 different aspen trees. But in reality, they're one tree expressing itself in 40,000 different ways. It raises questions about what it means for us to be an individual. You would look at a person and say, wow, look at that individual single being over there, that single person over there. But in reality, science has shown us that our bodies are filled with hundreds of thousands or millions or billions, I don't know, of microorganisms. That's why we take lots of probiotics and prebiotics to continue to fill our body with those microorganisms. So that person over there is thousands of beings, all existing in one space. We may try to distinguish and say that individuality is linked to maybe DNA. And we say that, oh, the aspen trees are all the same because they all have the same exact DNA. And humans are different because we have different DNAs. But think of a hive of honeybees. This is one hive of honeybees. This one hive exists as an organism all to itself. This one hive lives in that same hut, and they all work together for one common goal as one singular functioning organism made up of tens of thousands of different DNA'd beings. It's very similar to our brains. Our brains, we would say, is one organism, but it's made up of millions of cells that are all different, and they all do different parts, but they work together towards one common goal. It feels like one, but it's made up of millions. In spiritual terms, Buddhists for a long time have talked about an ego death, a dying to the self. Many other religious traditions have a similar vein of thought. These spiritual leaders came to the realization and the understanding that individuality is a really helpful concept. It's really easy for us to communicate, to point out, oh, that's Dave over there, the individual Dave, and we know who everyone is talking about. But this concept of individuality also obviously has flaws and limitations. Those are not 40,000 individual aspen trees. Those are one aspen tree expressing itself in many different ways. We may have different DNA than other people around us, but we don't and we can't exist on our own. If you took a human being and locked them in a dark, windowless room, they wouldn't survive. Even if you fed them a multivitamin and provided food for them, there is no life in that. There is no fullness of life in that without recognizing that we as individuals are also part of a larger individual whole. Just like honeybees are an individual, but it's essential for them to be part of a larger individual hive. We are deeply connected to all of the beings around us. We are deeply dependent on many plants for food and for medicine. We are deeply dependent on other humans to take care of us, to help shelter us. We are deeply dependent on the earth to provide and nurture us. We are all part of one massive living organism, Earth itself. Okay, again, this is not a philosophy channel, and I'm not a philosophy expert. I'm not a Buddhist expert, spirituality expert. But I'm growing to understand a lot of those things, and they're growing to shape my life. It's important for me to recognize that my actions or misactions impact not just myself but others. And my actions that impact others in many ways impact myself. One example would be, if I poisoned the water downstream of me, it wouldn't directly impact me, right? But it would harm other humans and other beings downstream of me. And that very well may in turn come back to haunt me. Those other humans might come back to sue me or to punch me in the face or whatever it is. We are deeply connected. And understanding that connection makes us better partners in this grand ecosystem of life. So, bringing it back to the garden. We'll talk about just a backyard garden here. It doesn't have to be big. It doesn't have to be a forest of aspen trees for this to connect and to make sense. We, as gardeners, cannot take our tomato plants and lock them in a dark, windowless room and feed them a few multivitamins and expect them to thrive and live a full and happy and worthwhile life. When we look at our garden and we try to single out individuals the individuals we want and get rid of all else. We spray pesticides to get rid of the individual pests we don't want. We feed the soil with inorganic, just very basic fertilizers that just contain the essentials for life: nitrogen, phosphorus. Right? We remove plants from this larger ecosystem in which they need to live in, and they do exist in. Your backyard garden is itself a full, diverse, living being, in the same way that a honeybee hive is full of different DNA'd beings all working together as one living hive being, in the same way that your brain is full of billions of cells all working together for one common goal. Your backyard garden needs to be filled with a wide diversity of different beings all working together for the common goal of life. If you have aphids in your garden and you spray to remove the aphids, you are removing an essential part of this broader ecosystem. They may harm your plants, but so does being locked in a windowless dark room. A better way of approaching things, I've found, is to add to the systems. Add as much as you can. Add all the life and all the experience and all the hardship and all the ups and all the downs. That makes a full and fulfilling life for us and for plants. Add to the system. So aphids, for example, find other beings who eat those aphids and keep them in check. Ladybugs are a great example of this. Well, what do you need to get ladybugs on your property? You can't just go to a store and dump a bucket of ladybugs. People do that, but what happens is there's no food for the ladybugs there. So you need to provide sources of food, and you need to provide sources of nectar and pollen for a wide diversity of insects to keep the overall insect population in your backyard garden in check. Everything working together, everything working in balance, everything working in homeostasis. You can't just feed your soil with, liquid IV treatments or with just a multivitamin. You need a wide diversity of living beings all in the soil working together. You need to feed your soil with life, with compost, with manure. You need to feed your soil because those living microorganisms in the soil help to break down the nutrients and pass them off to the plants. The fungi, the mycelium in the soil help to connect plants to one another so they can respond to disease and to pressures and pest pressures all as one organism. If one plant is under pressure, is dealing with a pest, it can send signals and communicate with others around it so that everyone can prepare for that pest. When you take the health and the life and the vitality away from your plants, when you remove connections by destroying mycelium in the soil, when you take away those microorganisms that help to break down nutrients to make your plants more healthy, you harm the system as a whole. It works for a short time, but we're finding more and more that farmers are having to dump more and more and more fertilizer on their fields every year, and it's not making any more food because the plants are now dependent, and the soil is dependent on this outside dump of fertilizer because it hasn't been fed a healthy diet. The soil, the ecosystem as a whole hasn't been taken care of as a whole. We've been treating these corn stalks as individuals. This individual corn stalk needs more nitrogen, needs more phosphorus. I'm just going to give it that. We forget that there's a whole working, living, moving ecosystem being that is our backyard garden, that is our fields, that is our forests. There's a popular saying in the permaculture world where they talk about you don't have a slug problem. Your problem is a lack of ducks. Instead of removing our interpretation of pests from a system, we need to find more and more ways to add to the system. We have to look at our backyard gardens as a whole ecosystem. We can't just keep removing things we don't like. Instead, we need to add to the system and add to the system and strengthen our plants by providing a full life, of ups and downs. They can learn to fight pests on their own if given the opportunity to experience pests. If they can communicate with one another, the organism as a whole can learn and grow and develop together. The whole thing is one giant AI. You give an AI as much word and material and verbiage and pictures as it can process, and it makes it smarter and better. Give your backyard garden as much as it can, because it's a whole ecosystem. And if you try to parcel out that ecosystem into individuals and remove individuals, you're harming it. You're harming yourself. You're harming our planet. You're harming the ecosystem, the being that is Mother Earth. Have a great day, everybody.